I build tall, never capped in space. I won't stop till I hear him say, and I'm up again. I got tired eyes, need a cup of blend. That's right, in the AM, that's my only friend. No light, just the sun coming up on the horizon.
Welcome, friends. Today I'm conducting maintenance on the rear axle of the Jeep, which, in its stock configuration, is a Dana 35 Charlie, or custom housing completed by Chrysler at the factory. These axle assemblies are known for axle shafts breaking easily under load and while off-roading. I briefly considered upgrading the axle to a Dana 44, but the expense and the difficulty and the fact that my mother would mostly be driving the vehicle on the road made me plan for simple servicing of the existing axle assembly. I wanted to replace all the suspension components one at a time so that I could scrub and paint the axle bit by bit. The first component I planned on removing was the upper control arm, which has two bushing body mounts and a single ball joint axle mount. Removing the upper control arm turned out to be the hardest part of the rear axle refresh. I gave up after about an hour of trying to remove the upper control arm and decided to be productive working on the rest of the suspension, starting with the shocks, which have a single bolt to the frame and to the axle. The nice thing about this is that the nuts are welded on, so there's no worries about them falling off and rolling away somewhere. Both bolts require a 15mm socket. Next up was the sway bar removal. The sway bar links require a 15mm and 18mm wrench to remove, and the axle mount bushing brackets take a 15mm socket and ratchet. The next thing for me was removing the spring. I lowered the jack since the upper control arm was still supporting the axle, pressed down on the driver's side of the axle, and pulled out the spring before working on removing the rubber spring isolators, which I would also be replacing. Now I got a little distracted here and there, but next I went for the brake caliper. The WJ does have a single piston disc brake in the rear, and I removed the whole assembly at once using an 18mm socket, which holds the bracket onto the axle. The caliper is connected to that bracket via the guide rods. I always put my parking brake on, even in automatics, and I needed to remember to release the parking brake before pulling off the rotor. I have seen a few WJs which had these nifty lock washers on the studs, but mine did not, so the rotor popped right off after I removed the parking brake. To finish off the driver's side, I removed the lower control arm using a 21mm socket and wrench. These bolts are torqued very tight, so I used an impact gun. I also want to mention that they strip out fairly easily, so make sure that you're using the right size and you don't have any wonky Pittsburgh wrenches that will allow them to strip. These rear lower control arm bushings were definitely worn and needed to be replaced. I placed the new control arm into position loosely to make sure that I maintained the correct orientation and I'd be ready to reattach so that it would help support the axle laterally whenever I removed the upper control arm. Hopefully, eventually, I would get that thing off. Next I moved on to the passenger side to knock out the same thing. Finally, after finishing the passenger side, I was back for round 2 with the upper control arm, having purchased a ball joint fork. I lost round 2, but for round 3 I tried a different approach and just removed the ball joint from the axle using a 21mm wrench to loosen and remove the 3 bolts. This took a very long time because the bolts are drenched in blue Loctite, absolutely drenched in them. And I did not have enough leverage, so I had to use a 30mm wrench to give me that leverage and just do it bit by bit. After another hour of rough wrenching, the upper control arm finally came off. I had originally planned to transfer over the brackets to the new upper control arm, but after looking at the brackets themselves, I decided I was going to paint them beforehand and just moved on. Alright, onto the differential. There are 10 13mm bolts holding on the differential cover, and I used a putty knife to open the RTV seal and dump the oil. I was pretty surprised to see green oil come out. I've never seen that before, but checking the forums, apparently that's the standard Mopar oil color. After dumping the pan out into a sealed bucket, I began cleaning the inside of the diff with brake cleaner, and also started looking at the mating surface for the diff cover and cleaning that off also. I had spent about 45 minutes cleaning out the diff before I noticed something odd. The gears inside the diff looked like they were all torn apart with loads of pits all over them. It wasn't wear, so I decided to just stay calm and do some research before panicking. I went ahead and covered up the gears since I'd be painting the axle with the cover off. Next I moved on to removing the calipers, and since I'd be replacing the brake lines, I went ahead and clamped the old lines with vice grips and then cut the calipers off. So I finally stopped and did my research. The pits were the result of the Jeep sitting. I had recalled the previous owner saying that it was sitting for a couple or a few or maybe just years, but when I spoke with him later, he reiterated that he definitely told me it was approximately 5 years that this Jeep was sitting. 5 years. Apparently I have very selective hearing while I'm making impulse Jeep purchases. In any case, the oil only fills about half of the differential, so anything that's not sitting in oil will rust and pit over time. I didn't want to ride it out and wait until the gears shredded the housing, especially if my mom had it, so I looked up replacing the gears. And the cheapest I found was around $95 plus tax and shipping. That's fairly expensive. I also don't really know what I'm doing. It kind of scared me a little bit, and I figured since the Dana 35 itself was a weak point that I should at least go and check out the junkyard to try and find a non-Verilok Dana 44. Of course, in all the excitement, I ended up pulling the only Dana 44 that I could find, out of a 2-wheel drive V8 WJ and bought it and threw it in the Raptor. The Dana 44 is pretty heavy and it doesn't have hex bar handles, so it was very hard for me to move around. I used a 2-wheel wheelbarrow at the junkyard to get it to the truck, and then I did my best back-braking clean to get it onto the tailgate and lift one side onto the deck system. The axles wrecked the deck system, by the way, shredded the plastic top. But I got it home, threw on the new wheels that I'll talk about later, and started cleaning it up to get it painted before I pulled out the Dana 35. I had zero intention of stripping the axle all the way down, but I wanted to get the surface rust off to throw on some rust reformer and then some black chassis paint. So I degreased it, and then I spent a while using a wire wheel on a drill. And like I mentioned before, this is awful. Buy a wire wheel for an angle grinder instead, unless you need the low speed of a drill. I used brands from Harbor Freight for the paint, but I don't recommend them at all. I do highly recommend the VHT chassis and roll bar paint. The valve on that paint is very difficult to press, so you will need one of those plastic paint can guns. But that stuff is thick and tough and awesome. The Harbor Freight stuff, on the other hand, it is half the cost, but it's not worth the hassle at all. It gets like melted in the sun. It's just really weird. It's not good at all. In order to finish disconnecting the Dana 35, I needed to remove the parking brake lines and ABS wheel speed sensors. I did not research removing the parking brake at all until failing miserably to remove it. I hate drum brakes and parking brakes because of how hard it is to mess with the springs and the clips, and until this project, really learn how to adjust them properly. There are 2 spring clips on the top and the bottom which are rectangular, so the pin itself needs to be rotated or slid to an opening to remove them. After that, the only thing holding on the brake shoes are the springs at the ends of the shoes. The adjustment side is a soft spring, so I removed that one first with a small pry bar, and then I could rotate the shoes off with the other spring still attached. Once the tension is removed from the parking brake line retainer, it can be unlocked and you can push or pull the line out. The ABS wheel speed sensor is held in with an 8mm bolt just like the front. I recommend pushing it out after removing the bolt so that it doesn't snap or break the wires. The differential breather is actually what bolts on a small hard brake line distribution block. I tried cutting the metal band which holds it on, but I just ended up sliding it off the barb. Mine was in decent condition, but it may be advisable to replace the line if it's cracked or lacks flexibility, since you want to avoid getting water in the axle assembly. The line runs to the top of the EVAP box underneath the rear bumper on the driver's side, so you'd have to drop one side of that to disconnect the hose. But that would provide you a great opportunity to lengthen it and reroute it up higher or to the engine bay with an ARB kit. I clamped and cut the main brake line running to the axle before disconnecting the driveshaft at the axle pinion by removing the 4 strap retaining bolts using an 8mm socket. My driveshaft wouldn't rotate, so I had to put the transfer case into neutral to allow access to all 4 bolts. The U-joint was rusted to the pinion, so I did need a pry bar to pop it off. Now that everything was disconnected, it was out with the old and in with the new. I thought I'd be cool and just roll the new axle underneath, but the body was still too low even with the 3-ton jack stands all the way up. I ended up installing the spacers early to try and swing the wheels around the body, and did a little bit of sketchiness by temporarily installing the hitch and using a hitch recovery insert as a lifting block. This was dangerous and should not have been done. With the axle under the Jeep, I could start bolting up the suspension, starting with the new ball joint. I bought both the front and rear suspension setup from 1A Auto, and they are stock equivalent items. If I had to do this for my own Jeep, I'd probably do what most people do and buy a 3-inch kit from Rough Country, or hopefully most likely I'd have the money to do a long arm Iron Rock off-road kit, and replace the components as needed, so that I could get an all-in-one adjustable setup to correct the pinion angle. I could build completely off of that. But I didn't want to adjust anything. I didn't want to mess with anything here. I wanted to retain stock ride comfort, so I went with the OE style components. Again, this is for my mom, so she doesn't need the full-on off-road setup. The upper ball joint bracket bolts onto the axle with 3 bolts requiring blue Loctite, a 21mm socket, and a torque of 100 foot-pounds. After getting the ball joint onto the axle, I could rotate the axle into position and loosely connect the lower control arms. Next was installing the upper control arm and loosely bolting it in. I did end up using a ratchet strap to help with centering the axle and getting the ball joint into position. Everything was loose on the bottom, so this wasn't about pulling against misaligned brackets or bushings or anything like that. But it was about making it easier to slide the heavy axle, wheels, and tires on the floor. I was scared to bolt down the ball joint nut all the way in case I needed to remove the axle again for some reason, so I left that loose to begin with. While connecting the drive shaft, one of the bearing caps fell off and rusted dry bearings fell out, so I left it disconnected and moved on to installing the new springs. These springs are part of a 2-inch lift kit from Iron Rock Off-Road. I prefer springs to pucks, and I didn't want anything greater than 2 inches because of the center of gravity, the tire size, and driveline issues from the front drive shaft. 2 inches also makes it more manageable to get in and out of. At this point, I felt comfortable enough to snug down the upper control arm ball joint and moved over to installing the shocks. These shocks are Doge shocks, which I bought in the 2-inch kit from Iron Rock Off-Road. The stock shocks have a body down orientation, but I didn't want to worry about debris and water getting past the seals, and I read a lot of people saying that you can have issues at full droop with the body hitting the spring perch. The shocks aren't that much larger than the stock shocks, and there shouldn't be any additional travel, so I should be fine either way. But after some Googling, I decided to go body up. Just a couple weeks ago, though, I decided to email the manufacturer and ask them to verify, and I called Iron Rock Off-Road immediately after that. Iron Rock said that these shocks absolutely have to be installed body down. The manufacturer did get back and replied that their shocks can go either way, but I do have to report that flipping them body down made a huge difference. The body up was very harsh, and I kept telling myself that it was just new suspension, but after flipping the shocks with the body down, they're now working appropriately, so these definitely do need to be body down. Unfortunately, you will see me messing with these shocks a few more times because the fitment wasn't great. I didn't get the full hardware kit in the first order, but Iron Rock sent me out the extra hardware right away. But then it was still missing 2 sleeves, which were supposed to be provided by Doge in their boxes. But they were not, so Iron Rock ended up sending me out additional sleeves to make it all work. This was all a huge hassle that took place over about 3 weeks, but I'm grateful for Iron Rock because they were so friendly and helpful and made sure that I had everything I needed. When I went to go test fit the drive shaft, I had forgotten about those needle bearings falling out, so I threw some grease in there with the needle bearings and I put it all back together before putting the drive shaft on to the differential for a test fit. Alright, so I'm pausing here to talk about why I was nervous about doing an axle swap from the beginning. As long as you're swapping in a Dana 44A, sometimes known as a Dana 44 HD, which is completely different from the standard Dana 44, by the way, you can mount the axle right up. Again, as long as it came off another stock WJ, all the mounting points are the same, so it'll work. There are still 3 issues though. The first one is the gear ratio. A standard 4.0 WJ came with Dana 30 front, Dana 35 rear, and 3.55 to 1 gears front and back. All Dana 44As on either the 6-cylinder or the 8-cylinder came with 3.73 to 1 gears front and back. Obviously the gears have to match. So if you have a stock 3.55 gear on your vehicle and you want to upgrade to a Dana 44A in the rear, you need to either swap the gears, which is pretty expensive and might be difficult for you, or swap the whole axle assembly, which might be beneficial for you anyway if you want matching Verilog front and rear axles. But my mom's Jeep came with 373 gears stock as part of the tow prep package, so I was good to go there. The next issue is the drive shaft type and length. There is apparently a Unicorn WJ with a 4.0 engine, a 42 RE transmission, an NP242 transfer case, and a Dana 44A axle. So I suppose if you're really lucky, you could find that at the junkyard and grab both the rear axle and the drive shaft at the same time. Otherwise, you're going to have an issue because the Dana 44A differential housing and the pinion are longer than that of the Dana 35. Which means that the drive shaft needs to be shorter. Now, generally speaking, you can't just grab a different drive shaft off of your donor vehicle because of our third problem, which is the transfer case. There are different connection types at the transfer case. There's also different drive shaft types because of that connection type. And even if you did end up finding a drive shaft in the right length, and it is slip yoke, so it'll fit on there, there's probably a different number of splines on that yoke. And also your front and drive shaft connection could be completely different. So even if you were able to work out the rear drive shaft, you could have issues with the front drive shaft. So the fix for problems 2 and 3 are either a slip yoke eliminator and a custom drive shaft, which is, it's gonna come out pretty expensive. And it's going to take a lot of time to actually get that done. Or you can do adjustable control arms in the rear. If you're planning on lifting the vehicle anyway, your kit will most likely come with adjustable control arms. But it can be difficult to make all of that work because you're going to have to lengthen those control arms, which means that you could have issues with the axle hitting the gas tank, or hitting the rear bumper, or hitting the exhaust. There's a whole bunch of problems there. Or the easiest solution, if you happen to have someone who can do it in your area, is to just shorten the drive shaft. I was still holding out hope that I could magically make it fit, and I was surprised to find out that the impact point is actually at full droop and not at full tuck. In my head, I was picturing the axle getting farther away from the vehicle at full droop, which meant that, there wouldn't be any impact there. But because the axle pivots at the forward body mounts, it rotates forward into the transfer case and causes the drive shaft to impact the transfer case and possibly damage the entire drivetrain, which is why you don't want to drive on this, unless you absolutely have to, I suppose. But you need to make some sort of change. I mounted the GoPro to the axle for this shot, so it's a little hard to tell, but the drive shaft is too long. So what the internet said was true. The Dana 44 is not a direct fit, even on a Jeep with 373 gears in the front, because the drive shaft is just a little too long. How long? Well, the parts diagram doesn't say, but Rock Auto lists a drive shaft for that Unicorn Straight 6 with the same transfer case with a drive shaft that is 0.75 inches shorter than the Dana 35 Straight 6. So I still had the Dana 35 sit in the back of the Raptor, so I measured from pinion to axle center on both axles and found a 3/4 of an inch difference between the two. This matched up in my head, and luckily I had gone to see the previous owner a few days earlier and mentioned the possible drive shaft issue. he told me that there was a legit Driveshaft shop in town. I drove down there with my shaft in hand and was very surprised when he just told me to come back in 90 minutes and it would be done. I got the Driveshaft issue fixed, but after seeing how much grime had accumulated around the pinion, I figured I should replace the pinion seal before installing the Driveshaft. I watched several DIYs before doing this and figured it would be easy, but this was actually awful. The first thing I did was mark on the nut, yoke, and diff housing to note how tight the pinion nut was. This would hopefully ensure that I don't over-tighten the nut when reinstalling. Then I removed the nut using a 1 5/16 socket, which I found in the oversized 3/4 inch socket section of Lowe's. I had to buy a 3/4 inch to 1/2 inch adapter at the same time in order for it to work with my impact. Zipping the nut off was fairly easy with the impact. I just needed to hold the yoke in place, which I expected to spin like crazy, but it didn't really spin like I thought it would. I hammered off the yoke with a soft mallet like I'd seen in some DIYs, but it took forever, and I think it would have been easier to just pry it off. The issue with this whole process is that the Dana 44A or HD, the housing is aluminum, and it's very easy to damage, so you have to be careful. It ended up taking me over an hour to remove the old seal, and I'm not quite sure if there's a better technique for this. I have seen the seal pullers, and I tried something similar to that on the front axle, but it did not help at all. It just ended up ripping the seal from the inside instead. So this was all just a massive struggle for me. And obviously, really, everything's frustrating for me. So it was really frustrating. I got everything cleaned up and deburred before the very simple task of hammering in the new seal. This was way harder than I thought also. I imagine that I could have spent more time smoothing out the interior and maybe even lubing up the seal to make it go in easier. But I ended up using a bit of wood to soften the hammer blows and fully seat the seal before reinstalling the yoke and nut, ensuring that the appropriate amount of threads were visible and that the markings lined up. If you're experienced, you could probably just tell by the preload while spinning the yoke, but I did not. The Driveshaft shop had to remove the U-joints to put the Driveshaft on the lathe, so I just gave them an extra $25 to install each of the new U-joints on the Driveshaft. I did ask for them to remove 3/4 of an inch, but if you couldn't tell from the pictures earlier, they took off a whole inch. I've read a lot of people on the forums recommending removing 1 1/4 inches whenever doing this swap, and those people never reported anything bad, so I'm sure that the extra 1/4 inch should be fine regardless. I threw some grease on the splines. Make sure that you're only putting this on the splines themselves and not on the outside of the shaft like I did. It made it very difficult to actually seal that up after I put the grease there. The differential side of the Driveshaft is secured by those 4 bolts, which require an 8mm socket and are torqued down to 14 foot-pounds. I pulled the springs to test the Driveshaft fitment over the travel range, but since that was done, I could now do the final install of the springs and bump stops. The bump stops cannot fit between the coils, so they need to be installed inside of the springs at the same time. Next, I installed the diff breather and new brake line block. I knew I wanted to replace the old brake lines, and these stainless steel lines from PowerStop weren't too much more expensive than the OEM style lines. They don't have any additional length, but we don't have any additional travel, so it should be fine. I installed the block with a 14mm deep socket before running the hard brake lines, which attach to the axle. The hard brake lines are the same for both the Dana 35 and the Dana 44. I had 2 sets now, so I just chose the best looking set. I installed them using a 3/8 inch wrench. Once the hard brake lines were done, I turned my attention to the brakes themselves. I cleaned up the dust shield, reinstalled the parking shoes, threw on the new rotor and installed the SpiderTrack spacers. As always, I use standard silver anti-seize on the hub and rotor surfaces to prevent anything from rusting or sticking together. I think that the Jeep community is a little more comfortable with the use of spacers than the BMW community, but whether you're going 180 on a racetrack or off-roading at a crawl, there are dangers associated with using spacers. I went with SpiderTracks despite the high cost because of the reputation, the quality, and the fact that they actually came in the 1 1/4 inch size, which is what I wanted to avoid wrecking fenders at full articulation. These spacers help widen the stance to lower the center of gravity, but they also, they help me actually fit the new wheels and tires. The spacers come with their own red thread locker and great instructions to properly torque the included lug nuts onto the hub or axle. The rear axle is pretty easy to torque since you can lock the transfer case, pull the e-brake, reinstall the opposing tire, any of these things to make sure that nothing spins while you're torquing. I had to get creative on the front axle, which you'll see in a couple episodes. The axle was almost done, but I still needed to clean out the differential. I did crack open the diff at the junkyard because I was scared that this one would also have pitted gears, but I waited until after pulling the axle and was surprised to find a Verilok carrier inside. If you recall, I did not want a Verilok axle because they're more expensive to maintain as far as axle shafts, and they're not serviceable for the actual clutch packs. If you don't know, Verilok is an updated, non-serviceable version of TrackLock, which is basically a clutch-based limited slip differential. I've read a lot of bad reviews for these, and apparently the clutches wear out super fast, and since they aren't serviceable, you would need to buy a whole new carrier for around $2,000 to fix them. I didn't want to deal with any of that, but it doesn't really matter, right? If something does fail, I'd rather buy an air locker and new axles for around the same price as getting a new Verilok carrier. And like I mentioned before, there weren't any other Dana 44 axles at the junkyard because they had recently crushed several of them. So I was stuck with this one regardless. So back on the brakes, off camera, I had gone about trying to compress the caliper pistons using a C-clamp, but I found that the driver's side caliper was completely frozen. Not even a sledgehammer could get that piston to budge. I didn't want to buy another older caliper from the junkyard, which would probably also fail soon, so I ran to O'Reilly's and I bought a pair of refurb calipers. They sell 2 different levels, and unfortunately the ones I bought were mixed. So one of them had been rebuilt, sandblasted, and coated. The other one had just been rebuilt and had some pretty significant rust on it. I sanded down both of them and painted them with some black caliper paint, waiting a couple of days before installing the new stainless lines and the calipers. I was very happy that these calipers use banjo bolts because I hate whipping lines around and trying to get both sides tightened correctly. The soft line to hard line connection requires a 3/8 inch wrench, and I believe the banjo bolts were 11 millimeter torqued to 23 foot-pounds. The caliper brackets were 18 millimeter torqued to 66 foot-pounds, and the slide pins were a hex bit at 21 foot-pounds. Next, I did the final ball joint torque on the upper control arm at 105 foot-pounds before finishing the brake line, parking brake, and sensor connections on the upper control arm. I needed to bleed the lines and put some fresh brake fluid in the Jeep, so I pumped out as much old fluid as I could before topping off the reservoir and flushing/bleeding the lines. I've had some sketchy issues in the past with replacing lines on my X5M because air got into the ABS pump and I had to buy a special scanner to run the bleed procedure, which activated the ABS and pumped all the air out. This is why I chose to clamp and cut the lines to begin with and avoid any other capping or sealing procedure while the calipers were off. I did not run into any issues with the rear axle bleed procedure, and I used a normal one-man bleeder from O'Reilly's to do the brake bleed. So I did have to use my foot to pump it, right? To pump the pedal. I was definitely kicking myself for not bringing my Motive pressure bleeder from home. I highly recommend those pressure bleeders, and whatever you do, don't buy a vacuum bleeder. They're garbage, in my experience anyway. I got the hardware kit in from Iron Rock Off-Road and installed the proper size sleeve and the 3 washers per side, which make sure that you don't crush your mounting bracket while torquing. I torqued this down using a 15mm socket to 80 foot-pounds. I had ordered red wrinkle engine enamel for the valve cover, but it took too long to arrive, and I ended up using locally sourced black enamel for the valve cover. Since I had the paint lying around, I decided to use it on a few other parts of the vehicle, including the diff covers and the front recovery hooks. I will say that while the black paint went on thick and cured after a few days, the red paint went on thin, ran easily, and took a couple of weeks to cure. I do not recommend the red wrinkle paint at all. But since I had some extra time waiting on the Iron Rock parts, I did decide to hand paint the black lettering into the diff cover and informational plates. This was totally unnecessary, and if you look close enough, it looks like a 5-year-old did it, but it looks pretty cool from far away, and I used the black caliper paint for this and cleared over everything afterward. Since I did want to make sure that this diff sealed up well, and I guess to kind of make it a lot easier to do differential oil changes in the future, I did buy a lube blocker gasket. This was a pain because I originally bought a Dana 35 lube blocker gasket, and I had to then buy a Dana 44 lube blocker gasket, which they do sell. But now I just have a random extra Dana 35 lube blocker gasket sitting in my garage. The rear differential bolts require a 13mm socket and are torqued down to 30 foot-pounds. The lube blocker packaging has the appropriate torquing order on it. Another annoying part of swapping the axle is that the AMSOIL gear oil that I bought for the Dana 35 does not work for the Dana 44. I ended up buying some Valvoline 75W140 from AutoZone and also bought some friction modifier from O'Reilly's, even though the Valvoline is supposed to work with LSDs. Having hand painted the informational plates, I knew that the diff took 72 ounces of 75W140 synthetic and 4 ounces of friction modifier. 72 ounces is 2.25 quarts, so I bought 3 and I'd figured that I would just eyeball it. A better option that I've used in the past is using a Rubbermaid juice container to get accurate volume and just pumping it into the diff. You can also use the same container to pump the oil out if you don't want to crack open the cover. Next up was reinstalling the rear sway bar. This thing was pinky thin and there are aftermarket options, but I didn't want to spend all that extra money. So it got a fresh coat of paint. The bushings were also in great condition, so I kept those and bolted everything back together using a 15mm socket and 18mm wrench. The gas tank heat shield uses some weird clip bolts that you have to install off of the vehicle, but I forgot how I even got that thing off weeks before, so I just reinstalled it using the 10mm sheet metal nuts, and just a couple weeks ago now, I awkwardly put the bolt clips back on to properly secure it. I was getting ready to finally put the Jeep back on the ground after around 3 weeks. I still needed to torque the control arm bushings, but that needed to be done on the ground in its proper ride height. So I only tightened those bolts down enough to take up any slack on the brackets and made sure that the bushing still moved freely. Now was the time to get the new wheels and tires on. I had been looking at options for weeks and settled on keeping the old rims, painting them bronze before installing Hankook AT2 Extreme tires in 245/75 R16 sizing. These were 3-peak and highly acclaimed tires, so I was ready to spend the $800 to $1,000 on getting them installed. But just before placing the order, I was at the junkyard looking for some other part for the build, and I saw a newly delivered 2011 Jeep Grand Cherokee with brand new tires on the rims, and I mean brand new, rubber fuzzies and everything. I don't know why that Jeep was sitting in the junkyard, but I wasted no time in throwing my bag on the ground and pulling the tires, nearly passing out, shuttling the wheels and tires 2 at a time to my truck 600 meters away in Georgia's humid 90-degree heat. The pull-apart team gave me a free water, actually. And I was really excited about this find because I used some points and some return value that was on my account at Pull Apart, and I ended up paying only $130 for the wheels and tires, and then I still ended up getting $64 cash back on my core return on the old rims. So I paid very little for these rims and tires, and it was just a great find. I put the Jeep on the ground and torqued the lug nuts to 100 foot-pounds. And also, because of the angle of the diff on the jack stands, I wasn't able to completely fill the diff, so I topped it off on the ground. You're not actually supposed to have the oil overflow. Like I said, it needs to be 2.25 quarts. But the 2-inch lift and unsettled suspension still didn't give me the correct angle to put the full amount of oil in. Now that everything was set, I drove the Jeep back and forth to settle the suspension and did the final torque on the suspension bushings. The sway bar bracket to axle bolts got torqued to 40 foot-pounds, the sway bar to link were 40 foot-pounds also, and the link to frame were 68 foot-pounds. The lower control arm was very difficult to torque since you risk rounding out the nuts. But I got it done using a 21mm socket and wrench and torquing the axle mount to 120 foot-pounds and the body mount to 115 foot-pounds. The upper control arm bolts use a 15mm socket and were 74 foot-pounds. This was the third time that I've messed with these rear shocks. Out of the kit that came with the shocks, only one sleeve seemed to fit, and I had to put it in the upper mount until the IRO hardware kit came and I swapped it out. Now I put that sleeve in the axle mount location, even though it still seemed too small. Now this is supposed to be torqued to 85 foot-pounds, but at 40 foot-pounds it was crushing the bracket and the sleeve. That's when I knew I had to call Iron Rock Off-Road again and ask if I was doing something wrong. Alright, so attempt number 4 at getting the rear shocks right was another week later. IRO sent me the correct sleeve, so I had to bend the brackets back into position and install the new sleeve. I started to see the bracket bending again while torquing it, so I just went up to 65 foot-pounds before calling it good. I had just slid on the diff breather earlier, but I figured I should put on an actual hose clamp, so I slid the old one off and used a worm-style clamp on the hose. I still needed to adjust the parking brake, so with the parking brake lever released, I lifted the rear axle, popped off the plugs, and used a small pry bar to rotate the adjustment wheel down to spread the shoes until the tires could no longer move. And then I backed it off 3 clicks and went to the other side to do the same. This can be challenging and time-consuming to adjust. After making the adjustment, I had pulled the carpet out from the inside and noticed that my cables were uneven. And sure enough, when I went to go double check my adjustment the second time, it wasn't properly done. So I had to correct the issue the second time around and make sure that everything was tight on both sides. So this is definitely going to be the most expensive episode. The brake cost included the whole front and rear rotor set with pads and brake lines, as well as the brake fluid and the rear calipers. The suspension was the front and rear springs, shocks, and spring insulators, which the insulators were surprisingly expensive. The suspension components were the control arms and the bump stops. The axle cost includes the axle, pinion seal, diff cover gasket, gear oil, and the cost of the Driveshaft service, which that service was $200 by itself to get it cut and replace the U-joints. The wheels and tires, that expense includes the cost of the front and rear tires, wheel spacers, the rims obviously, as well as new lug nuts and new wheel locks for the front and rear. Consumables include stripper, brake clean, and paint. This episode was nearly $3,000 by itself, and it brings the Jeep up to nearly $7,000. The extra 21 hours of labor from this episode brings the total project hours to 47 hours of labor. My takeaways from this episode are that a sitting vehicle can have more damage than you think. My original thought was, it will just have flat spots in the tires, and you'll need to get coolant and an oil flush. I definitely never considered the resulting damage to the differential gears. I also learned that bolt-on aftermarket parts don't always just bolt right on. The rear shocks, I think, are an extreme example of really just bad luck. But there are other times where items need a lot of adjustment to make them fit with your specific vehicle based on small variances. I did learn also to just stay calm and try to assess everything before making a decision. This is in reference to the gear pitting, but I came across issues on the front axle also, which I had to just stop and research before panicking too much. In this video, I replaced the entire rear suspension, and there were several points where I could have completely forgotten to install a bolt, let alone torque the bolt down. So missing something could result in costly repairs, but it could also literally get you killed if something falls apart on the highway. So you have to be very careful and remember to torque everything down. I'm actually still excited today that I was able to get those rims and tires. The rim and tire package weight is about 9 pounds more per corner than it would have been keeping the stock rims and getting oversized tires. This is a lot of weight, but the tires that are on there now are fuel efficient tires, and the rim size is going to have more tire options for future tire changes. Now, I never planned to change out the axle because it was really scary in my mind, just because I'd never done it before. But especially with the same chassis, no cutting and welding brackets, it was just super basic. So that is it for this episode. It was crazy long, but hopefully it was the longest episode, with the next episode being the shortest one. The next episode is all about the fuel system and some maintenance that I conducted to get it running smooth. Thank you for watching today, and I will see you next week.